I want to begin by thanking our witnesses. The Honorable Deanna Criswell, the Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Ms. Kristen Bernard, the Deputy Inspector General for Audits for Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. It's a long. And Mr. Chris Curry, the Director of Homeland Security and Justice for the United States Government Accountability Office, for being here today. I'm glad that's on your card. You probably don't want to say that every time you meet somebody. Today's hearing will focus on examining the propriety of the expanding use of FEMA resources and how it's impacting FEMA's ability to carry out its core mission. Fundamentally, FEMA's core mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. More specifically, states lead the responses to disaster, and FEMA comes in at the request of the state if the state's resources are overwhelmed, or at least that's how it was supposed to work. Increasingly, however, it seems that states are asking for help in more and more incidents that states themselves should be prepared to handle, like snowstorms in the Northeast. So we have an increasing reliance on the federal government, and then we add that FEMA is also being tasked to manage non-traditional disasters like pandemics and help with issues completely unrelated to its mission, or so-called non-Stafford Act disasters. Between 2014 and 2020, FEMA was deployed 7 times to address non-Stafford Act disasters. In just the last 3 years, that has jumped to 16 non-Stafford Act disasters. These include the crisis at our nation's southwest border, Operation Allies Welcome, Operation Vaccinate Our Workforce, and the list goes on. There is such an increasing demand on the agency that FEMA created a new National Incident Management Assistance Team to respond to disasters that fall outside FEMA's typical mission set. In addition to being called on to address these non-Stafford Act disasters from 2020 to 2023, FEMA also led the federal government's response to COVID-19. To date, as it relates to COVID-19, FEMA has obligated $75 billion in public assistance, $44.3 billion for individual assistance, $36.5 billion for lost wage assistance, and $3.1 billion for the COVID-19 funeral assistance program. Not surprisingly, with all this money flowing out, the DHSIG found billions in fraud and improper payments, sadly. In the Lost Wages Assistance Program alone, the DHSOIG estimated more than $3.7 billion, that's B with a billion, in improper payments. It got to a point that the OIG set up a COVID fraud unit, and stealing FEMA funding became a crime of convenience for criminal organizations, including related crimes like identity theft. What's more, FEMA has continued to defend the administration of the Lost Wages Assistance Program, going as far as to say that sufficient internal controls were implemented. The fact that FEMA has failed to implement more controls raises serious concerns about FEMA's recently announced interim rule, which would make significant changes to FEMA's individual assistance program. Some of the most shocking changes, including giving households $750 cash payments, paying individuals upfront for housing options of their choice, and providing upfront payments to individuals who are choosing to stay with family and friends. And I think we'll get into this under a self-certification circumstance. Many of these changes ignore some of the Inspector General's key recommendations to reduce fraud. The question really is, where is the accountability in all of this? Why aren't states doing what they need to do to budget for these costs? Where is the expectation that states, local governments, and individuals carry insurance? How are these added responsibilities on FEMA impacting its core mission, especially since we know from the GAO that FEMA has a workforce shortage that seems, from my count, to be pretty prolific? FEMA can't be all things to all people. We have to get a handle on the proper role of FEMA and ensure FEMA's internal controls reduce fraud and misuse of taxpayer funds. I'd look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues. We already kind of have briefly discussed the ever-expanding role of FEMA to include what I refer to as non-Stafford Act disasters. And as I highlighted in my opening statement, they seem to be increasing every single year. Now, Administrator Criswell, I think that you are dedicated to your mission. I think your staff, your employees are as well. And I think that in many cases, you've got this huge responsibility that's almost untamable under your purview, and the people, like I said, are good people that are trying to get the job done. You don't have the resources, and quite honestly, I don't think Congress has helped you very much by throwing more at you, but you've taken the job, so you're going to have to take the tough questions. One of the disasters we're talking about is the nation's southwest border. The Biden administration and the DHS secretary have claimed there's not a crisis, but obviously it's at least invokes some kind of disaster response, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Can you tell us how much money has FEMA spent to address the illegal foreign national crisis on the border?
Chairman Perry, thank you for the question. You know, FEMA's role in supporting the border operations has been limited to the grant programs that Congress has directed us to administer. As I stated in my opening statement, it started with the ESFP humanitarian program and now has moved into the shelter and services program. That is the money that we have committed, is what has been appropriated.
So how much is that?
I can get you the numbers, and I'll have the staff get you the exact year over year. I know that's available on public record. I just don't have it right now.
I'm seeing the emergency food and shelter humanitarian is $900 million. Shelter and services programs, $425 million. The emergency food and shelter itself, I think, is $775 million or something like that. The money that's been spent here, particularly by the charities that make up the board of the emergency food and shelter program, would you say it encourages? I mean, maybe not by design, but some people believe it is by design. Do you think it encourages legal crossings at the border by foreign nationals?
What I can tell you, Chairman Perry, is that we are facing a broken immigration system. And
I understand that.
This program that Congress has directed us to administer is providing relief to those border agencies, border communities, nonprofit organizations, small communities, to help them with the costs that they are incurring.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is if you're on the other side of the border and you know that when you come to this side of the border, you're going to receive, at a minimum, shelter, food, transportation, acute medical care, personal hygiene supplies, and everything necessary to manage that. Does that encourage people to stay on the other side of the border where they have none of that, or does that encourage them to come to this side of the border where they get all that?
Yeah, Chairman Perry, I am not an immigration expert on what the causes of people coming across the border are, but we will continue to support Congress's direction to help support those communities that are experiencing costs.
All right, well, I'm going to tell you that it does encourage them to come. And like I said, you are forced to, I guess, manage this program, so to speak. If FEMA was its own agency outside of the Department of Homeland Security, do you think that it would still repeatedly be called on to respond to the disaster at the southwest border?
The role of emergency managers continues to get more well understood, and I would say the role of FEMA in our technical ability to provide coordination and collaboration, we provide that level of support to many different federal agencies, not just the department.
No, I get it, but you have a direct line to the president in times of disaster.
Correct.
Right? You have direct, otherwise you generally work through the secretary. Have you had a conversation with the president regarding your work on the southwest border and the funds that are being expended there?
My conversations with the president have focused around the responses that we have been doing for natural disasters.
Does it include the border?
Just natural disasters.
Did you say just natural disasters?
Those are the things that I work with the president on.
Okay, so you haven't had a conversation with the president regarding your role as the administrator of FEMA and the money being spent at the southwest border?
I work through the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary.
But you have or have not had a conversation with the president? It should be easy.
No, I have not had a conversation with the president regarding the border. We are just administering the grant dollars that have been directed by Congress.
All right, thank you. Administrator Criswell, you mentioned the Economy Act. That was used to reimburse. Is there an interagency agreement that we can see regarding the use of those funds? Is there documentation regarding that the committee can can have?
For anything that we would be reimbursed for the Economy Act on, there should be paperwork. We'll be happy to follow up with you.
All right, we're going to formally request that. Administrator, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, as I understand it, is essentially the money that is allocated is then distributed or decided to be distributed by the National Board. Is that correct?
The Legacy Program, ESFP Humanitarian Program, yes. It was an existing program that we had that we adapted to meet the original or the initial direction by Congress to administer funding. The SSP program that it has now evolved into will not be.
That's a grant program, but I want to focus on the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, which does have the board. How many FEMA individuals oversee their work?
I would have to get back to you on the number. I know that we have a member of FEMA that sits on the board. Again, this was an existing program that does meet
I'm not blaming you
needs.
for it, ma'am. I'm just trying to get clarification, just to be clear here. But
yeah, I don't know how many, but I'd be happy.
And our understanding, just to let you know, it's one, right? It's one person, and you say that one person does sit on the board. This is an enormous amount of money. Does it, since the members of the board also have affiliate organizations in the states and in the various communities within those states, does it seem to you to be a good idea to have this board then decide where the money's going and who's getting it, knowing that in many cases they're picking their own affiliate organizations in the member states and cities and political subdivisions? Does that at all seem incestuous to you from a relationship of spending money and the fact that the organizations, the members of that board, exclusively decide where that money's being spent?
Yeah, the legacy or the initial emergency food and shelter program that we have is one that, again, we adapted to meet the needs of the direction back in 2019. It was an ill-suited program to meet the needs and the scale of the support that we were providing under the humanitarian side of that program. That's why we were grateful for Congress to direct the SSP program, as the board no longer has a role in making these decisions.
I understand, but this program still exists.
It does not exist.
It does not exist.
It has been sunsetted and it is now being replaced by the SSP program. We are still closing out.
How much money is left in the program?
I would have to get back with you with the specifics.
All right, I would like to know how much money is left in that program, and when is the timeline for that to expire?
We will not be doing any new obligations under that program. Everything will fall under the SSP program.
And when is that going to happen? I understand.
The SSP program started last fiscal year, and if appropriated, it will continue into this fiscal year.
Okay. The Inspector General reviewed 18 audits that they conducted related to FEMA's involvement in non-natural disasters. These 18 audits took place over the past 4 years. And Ms. Bernard, I have $3.8 billion in fraud, but I think you cited a different number. Can you clarify that?
3.8 is the correct number.
3.8, okay. So Administrator Criswell, I mean, apparently, like my question kind of was, does FEMA have sufficient controls in place to prevent fraud? But obviously they don't. I mean, I'm sure you're taking the recommendations, or at least you're hearing the recommendations of Ms. Bernard, but what are you offering in regard to changing that circumstance so we don't see that level? I mean, $3.8 billion might not seem much in the face of $7.2 trillion, but still a lot of money where I come from, and it's still a lot of money to the taxpayers of America. What are you recommending be done?
Chairman Perry, we take all concerns about fraud against our programs very seriously, and we appreciate the continued partnership and cooperation with the IG. Again, many of these recommendations we have already closed out, but there are some that we did not agree with the data that they used to provide that. We don't necessarily agree with the dollar amount cited by the IG, but we'd be happy to have a session with you in a closed session about our fraud controls.
I would like to know yours. I understand Ms. Bernard's doing it, but you don't agree, that's fine. But what do you know, you're the guy, you're the captain of the ship, as one of my colleagues said. Let me ask you this about these self-certifications and the potential for using that in the lost wages assistance program, to me, that is rife with fraud, and self-certification is one of the roots of that. Are you literally considering self-certification regarding the cash assistance, the changes to the individual assistance program, which would see $750 in cash assistance prior to or upfront housing? Are you still considering self-certification for that in light of what you've seen in the other programs?
So as it relates to the lost wages assistance program that was administered by the previous administration, and I was, of course, very concerned when I came into this role to learn about the potential fraud. This was a program that was the responsibility for executing between the state workforce agencies, and we continue to work with them to repay us for any of the amounts of money that has been was fraud. And to date, we have over $165 million that has been returned to FEMA. As it relates to our new program for serious needs assistance, it's an expansion upon an existing program that we have. Self-certification is just one of many steps that we use to make determinations on whether to issue that money.
So you are going to use self-certification?
It will be one of the steps that we will use, yes.
Well, if you're self-certifying, what other steps would you use that would negate self-certification?
We also use identity verification and a number of other things that we'd be happy to provide a full briefing on.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So FEMA is saying we're going to make sure that you are who you say you are. That's identification, but still allow you to self-certify in the face of what you just rightly criticized as the previous administration's fraud based on self-certification. But you're still going to use it in this instance, even though essentially what you're saying, we're just going to make sure you are who you say you are.
Chairman Perry, we believe that the processes that we are using are sufficient to make sure that we are determining that we are giving money appropriately. We put fraud controls in place, and I would be happy to have a separate session with you, not on public camera, about our fraud controls that we have in place.
All right. Well, I will tell you, and my time is way overdue for this round, but the self-certification process is very concerning to me, and the fact that we just identify the individual, that might be great after the fact to try and go collect that money that's fraudulently taken from the American people, but I think the self-certification process, even by your own admission, not that you handled it, that was another administration, is a problem, and I'm concerned that you would consider that as some kind of reasonable methodology to disperse money prior to, as a matter of fact, in advance, in any case. I just need further clarification. I understand the emergency food and shelter humanitarian program is being moved, or the functions of that, over to the shelter and services program under the grant format for driving those resources out. But the original legacy emergency food and shelter program, which has a board, will remain. Is that my understanding, or am I missing something?
So I know it can sound confusing. There was an existing program, emergency food and shelter program, that supported communities across the U.S. with some of their homeless populations. That program will continue.
Okay.
The adaption to that program for ESFP humanitarian has sunsetted, and it has been replaced with the shelter and services program.
So just for further clarification, for the legacy program that exists and has a board, is there anything to preclude those funds that will come or that remain in that program from anything that will preclude that money to be spent on people existing and residing in the United States who are illegal foreign nationals?
So we have eligible expenses within that program, and we reimburse jurisdictions, organizations for the list of eligible expenses that have been identified. I'd be happy to get you a list of what those eligible expenses are.
So if you know, and if you don't know, it's okay to say so, but that list, would it include, because these are homeless people in America living in some city or some town in America, does it preclude money from being spent on people residing illegally that are illegal foreign nationals in this country who are also homeless?
So you're talking about, I just want to make sure I'm clear, you're talking about the original program?
Yes, that has the board.
I do not know that specifically. I'd have to get back to you on that.
All right, I'd appreciate it if you would.